A gunboat is a naval watercraft designed for the express purpose of carrying one or more guns to bombard coastal targets, as opposed to those military craft designed for naval warfare, or for ferrying troops or supplies. History: in the Age of Sail, a gunboat was usually a small undecked vessel carrying a single smoothbore cannon in the bow, or just 2 or 3 such cannons. A gunboat could carry 1 or 2 masts or be oar-powered only, but the single-masted version of about 15 meters length was most typical. Some types of gunboat carried 2 cannons, or else mounted a number of swivel guns on the railings. The advantages of this type of gunboat were that since it only carried a single cannon, the boat could be maneuvered in shallow or restricted areas, where sailing was difficult for larger ships, such as rivers or lakes. The gun that such boats carried could also be quite heavy. A 32-pounder for instance. As such boats were cheap and quick to build, swarm tactics were favored. While a single hit from a frigate's broadside would destroy a gunboat, a frigate facing a large squadron of gunboats could be seriously damaged before it could manage to sink them all. Gunboats used in the Battle of Valker Island on Lake Champlain during the American Revolutionary War were mostly built on the spot, attesting to the speed of their construction. All navies of the sailing era kept a number of gunboats on hand. Gunboats saw extensive use in the Baltic Sea during the late 18th century as they were well suited for the extensive coastal skerries and archipelagos of Sweden, Finland and Russia. The rivalry between Sweden and Russia in particular led to an intense expansion of gunboat fleets and development of new gunboat types. The two clashed during the Russo-Swedish War of 1788–90, a conflict that culminated in the massive Battle of Svensksund in 1790, where over 30,000 men and hundreds of gunboats, galleys and other oared craft participated. The majority of these were vessels developed from the 1770s and onwards by the naval architect Fredrik Henrik Alf Chapman for the Swedish archipelago fleet. The designs were copied and refined by the rival Danish and Russian navies and spread to the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. 2 variants were the most common, a larger 20 gun sloop with 2 24-pounders, one in the stern and one in the bow, and a smaller 15 gun yawl with a single 24-pounder. Many of the Baltic navies kept gunboats in service well into the second half of the 19th century. British ships engaged larger 22 Russian gunboats off Turku in southeast Finland in 1854 during the Crimean War. The Russian vessels had the distinction of being the last oared vessels of war in history to fire their guns in anger. Gunboats were a key part of Napoleon's plan for the invasion of England in 1804. Denmark-Norway used them heavily in the Gunboat War. Between 1803 and 1812, the United States Navy had a policy of basing its navy on coastal gunboats, experimenting with a variety of designs. President Thomas Jefferson and his Republican Party opposed a strong navy, arguing that gunboats were adequate to defend America's major harbors. They proved useless against the British blockade during the War of 1812. Steam era equals. With the introduction of steam power in the early 19th century, the Royal Navy and other navies built considerable numbers of small vessels propelled by side paddles and later by screws. Initially, these vessels retained full sailing rigs, so that steam propulsion was used as an auxiliary form. The British Royal Navy deployed 2 wooden paddle gunboats in the lower Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River during the rebellions of 1837 in Upper and Lower Canada. The United States Navy deployed an iron-hulled paddle gunboat, the Uss Michigan, to the Great Lakes in 1844. The Von der Tann was the first propeller-driven gunboat in the world. Conradi Shipyards in Kiel built the steam-powered 120 long tons gunboat in 1849 for the small navy of Schleswig-Holstein. Initially called Gunboat No. 1, Von der Tann was the most modern ship in the Navy. She participated successfully in the First Schleswig War. Britain built a large number of wooden screw gunboats during the 1850s, some of which participated in the Crimean War, Second Opium War and Indian Mutiny. The requirement for gunboats in the Crimean War was formulated in 1854 and was to allow for shore bombardment operations to be carried out in the Baltic. The first ships the Royal Navy built that met this requirement were the Arrow-class gun vessels. Then in mid-1854 the Royal Navy ordered 6 Gleaner-class gunboats, followed later in the year by an order for 20 Dapper-class gunboats. In May 1855, 6 Dapper-class gunboats were deployed to the Sea of Azov, where they repeatedly raided and destroyed stores around its coast. In June 1855, the Royal Navy re-entered the Baltic with a total of 18 gunboats as part of a larger fleet. The boats were used to attack various coastal facilities operating alongside larger warships from which they drew supplies such as coal. Gunboats experienced a revival during the American Civil War. Armed side-wheel steamers were quickly converted from existing passenger-carrying boats by Union and Confederate forces. Later, some boats were purposely built, such as the Uss Miami. They all frequently mounted 12 or more guns, sometimes of rather large caliber, and were usually armored to some degree. At the same time, Britain's gunboats from the Crimean War period were starting to wear out, so a new series of classes was ordered. Construction shifted from a purely wooden hull to an iron teak composite. In the later 19th century and early 20th century, gunboat was the common name for smaller armed vessels, often called patrol gunboats. These could be classified, from the smallest to the largest, into river gunboats, river monitors, coastal defense gunboats, and full-fledged monitors for coastal bombardments. In the 1870s–1880s, Britain took to building so-called flat-iron gunboats for coastal defense. When there would be few opportunities to recoal, vessels carrying a full sailing rig were still used as gunboats. HMS Gunboat, a sloop preserved at Chatham Historic Dockyard in the United Kingdom, is an example of this type of gunboat. In the U.S. Navy, these boats had the hull classification symbol PG. They usually displaced under 2,000 long tons, were about 200 feet long, 10 15 feet draft and sometimes much less, and mounted several guns of caliber up to 5 6 in. An important characteristic of these was the ability to operate in rivers, enabling them to reach inland targets in a way not otherwise possible before the development of aircraft. In this period, gunboats were used by the naval powers for police actions in colonies or weaker countries, for example in China. It is this category of gunboat that inspired the term gunboat diplomacy. With the addition of torpedoes, they became torpedo gunboats. In Britain, much of the gunboat fleet was disposed of as part of Admiral Fisher's reforms in the 1900s. A handful were still in service in various roles at the start of World War I. The very last in active service were 2 of the second Bramble class, which survived until 1926, carrying out river patrols in West Africa. In the circumstances of World War I, however, the Royal Navy re-equipped with small, shallow draft gunboats with sufficient speed to operate in fast-flowing rivers and relatively heavy armament. During the war and in the post-war period, these were deployed in Romania on the Danube, in Mesopotamia on the Euphrates and Tigris, in northern Russia on the northern Dvina, and in China on the Yangtze. In China, during anarchic and war conditions, they continued to be deployed until World War II in defense of British interests. Other Western powers did the same. More, larger, gunboats were built in the late 1930s for the Far East. Some were sailed there. Others were transported in sections and reassembled at Shanghai. World War II and the United Kingdom. Most British gunboats were withdrawn from the Far East early in World War II and redeployed in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean, where they supported various army operations in North Africa and southern Europe. Those that remained in the Far East were either handed over to the Chinese or lost to the Japanese. The American Yangtze patrol boats that did not travel to the Philippines in late 1941 were scuttled in China. Following the American defeat in the Philippines campaign, the craft was scuttled. The USS Asheville was sunk in action during the Battle of Java. Vietnam War. U.S. riverine gunboats in the Vietnam War included patrol boats river, constructed of fiberglass. Patrol craft fast, commonly known as swift boats, built of aluminum. And assault support patrol boats built of steel. U.S. Coast Guard 82-foot Point class cutters supplemented these U.S. Navy vessels. The ASPBs were commonly referred to as Alpha boats and were primarily deployed for minesweeping duties along the waterways, due to their all-steel construction. The ASPBs were the only U.S. Navy riverine craft specifically designed and built for the Vietnam War. All of these boats were assigned to the U.S. Navy's Brownwater Navy. See also, Monitor, River Gunboat, River Monitor, Torpedo Gunboat, List of gunboat and gun vessel classes of the Royal Navy, Japanese gunboat Chiyodagator, Japanese gunboat Sita, Japanese gunboat Onayu, SMS Panther, Von der Tann, Russian gunboat Koryats, Soviet gunboat Krasnoye Znamya, Spanish gunboat Callao, Spanish gunboat General Concha, Spanish gunboat Marques del Douro, Yorktown-class gunboat, TT-400 TP gunboat. Notes. References: Anderson, Roger Charles, Oared Fighting Ships, From Classical Times to the Coming of Steam. London. 1962. Chappell, Howard, The History of the American Sailing Navy Norton. 1949. Friedman, Norman. U.S. Small Combatants, An Illustrated Design History 1987. Naval Institute Press. ISBN 0-87021-713-5. Gleat, Jan, Navies and Nations, Warships, Navies and State Building in Europe and America 1500 1860 Arnqvist and Weichsel International, Stockholm. 1993. ISBN 91-22-01565-5. Preston, John Anthony, Send a Gunboat. The Victorian Navy and Supremacy at Sea, 1854–1904. Conway Maritime, London. 2007. ISBN 978-0-85177-923-2. External links: HMS Gunnet,